I never thought I'd be that woman. The one whose husband replaces her with someone younger, someone who fits into his world better than she does anymore. Yet here I am, sitting in our Chicago apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, staring at my phone and wondering when everything went so terribly wrong. The text message came through just after noon. Home at 6. We need to talk. 6 words that made my stomach drop. We hadn't really talked in months, not since he'd started spending more time at the office, more time with her. His assistant, the one he'd hired without consulting me, the one who seemed to understand his work better than I ever could. I'd tried to be supportive, tried to be the wife he needed, but somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible in my own marriage. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt pushed aside or replaced, would you subscribe to this channel? These stories need to be heard. Women like us, we need to know we're not alone. Your subscription helps these messages reach others who are struggling in silence, who think they're the only ones going through this kind of pain. I sat at our dining room table, the Lake Michigan view stretched out before me through floor-to-ceiling windows. 30 years ago, when Robert first brought me to this apartment, I'd stood at these same windows and felt like the luckiest woman alive. He was ambitious, driven, already climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious investment firm. I was a schoolteacher from a modest family on the South Side, and he was offering me a life I'd never dared to dream of. The apartment smelled like the lavender sachets I kept in every room, a habit from my childhood when my mother would tuck them into drawers to keep things fresh. I'd carried that tradition into my marriage, into this gleaming high-rise that never quite felt like home, despite all the years we'd lived here. Robert used to tease me about it, said it reminded him of his grandmother's house. But that was before the long silences, before the separate bedrooms, before her. I remember the exact moment when that teasing changed. It was about 2 years ago, during one of his firm's cocktail parties that I'd helped organize. I'd overheard him talking to a colleague's wife, a woman who worked in corporate law, and she'd mentioned the scent of lavender. "Oh, that's Eleanor's doing," Robert had said, and there was something in his tone. Not affection, not the gentle humor he used to have. It was dismissive, almost apologetic, as if my little touches were embarrassing quirks he had to explain away. I'd stood there holding a tray of canapés I'd spent all afternoon preparing and felt something shift inside me. Something small but significant, like the first crack in a dam. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through our message history. The conversation had become so sparse, so transactional. Running late. Don't wait up. Out of town until Thursday. When had we stopped saying good morning? When had we stopped saying I love you? I scrolled further back, months and months, looking for the last time he'd sent me something personal. There it was, from February. Happy Valentine's Day. Dinner reservation at 8. Not even I love you or looking forward to tonight. Just the logistics of an obligation fulfilled. I'd worn my best dress that night, had my hair done at the salon, put on the perfume he'd given me years ago. He'd been distracted the entire evening, checking his watch, his phone buzzing constantly in his pocket. We'd been home by 9:30. My reflection caught in the darkened screen. 62 years old, with silver threads running through my auburn hair. The same green eyes that Robert had once said he could get lost in. The same small frame that he'd wrapped his arms around on our wedding day, promising to cherish me forever. I looked away. That woman felt like a stranger now, but had I let myself become a stranger? I thought about the woman I'd been before Robert, Eleanor Chen, 25 years old, fresh out of college with a teaching degree and dreams of making a difference. I'd taught second grade at a public school in Pilsen, loved every chaotic, exhausting minute of it. The kids would bring me drawings, tell me about their lives, hug me when they were sad. I'd felt needed, valued, seen. I'd met Robert at a charity fundraiser the school had organized. He'd been there representing his firm's community outreach program, looking sharp in his suit, completely out of place among the construction paper decorations and hand-painted banners. But he'd been charming, asked thoughtful questions about the school's needs, made me laugh with his self-deprecating humor about growing up privileged and sheltered. When he'd asked for my number, I'd been stunned. Men like him didn't usually notice women like me. Our courtship had been a whirlwind. Expensive dinners I felt awkward at, theater shows I didn't quite understand, parties with his colleagues where I smiled and nodded and tried to keep up with conversations about markets and mergers. But he'd been attentive, affectionate, seemingly fascinated by my perspective on the world. "You keep me grounded," he'd say. "You remind me what really matters." When had that changed? When had grounded become boring? When had my perspective stopped mattering? The apartment was silent except for the hum of traffic far below. I walked to the kitchen, my slippers shuffling against the marble floors. Everything here was expensive, carefully curated. Robert had hired an interior designer 5 years ago, someone who transformed our home into something straight out of Architectural Digest. I'd tried to have opinions, tried to participate in the decisions, but my suggestions were always gently dismissed. "Trust the professional, darling," he'd say. So I did. I always did. I remember crying in the bathroom the day the designer removed all my personal touches. The framed children's artwork from my former students, the colorful throw pillows I'd picked up at a street fair, the vintage bookshelf that had belonged to my grandmother. Visual clutter, the designer had called them. We're going for clean lines, sophisticated minimalism. Robert had agreed enthusiastically. I'd packed everything into boxes and stored them in our building's basement unit, where they'd been sitting ever since, gathering dust and symbolizing everything I'd given up to fit into his vision of what our life should look like. I made tea, Earl Grey, and sat by the window watching the afternoon light shift across the water. My hands trembled slightly as I held the cup. "We need to talk." Those words carried weight, didn't they? People didn't say that before good news. They didn't say that before anniversaries or vacations or anything resembling happiness. I thought about calling my sister, Margaret. She lived in Milwaukee, had warned me years ago that I was losing myself in this marriage. "You can't just be someone's wife, Ellie," she'd said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "You need to be your own person, too." I'd been defensive. Told her she didn't understand, that marriage was about compromise and partnership. But Margaret had shaken her head, said there was a difference between compromise and erasure. I hadn't spoken to her in 6 months. Pride, mostly. The inability to admit she'd been right all along. My mind drifted to the past 6 months, to all the signs I'd chosen to ignore. Robert had hired Madison in early spring, right after his previous assistant retired. She was 28, fresh from business school, sharp as a tack according to everyone at his firm. "She's a real go-getter," Robert had said during one of our increasingly rare dinners together. "Reminds me of myself at that age. I'd met her exactly once, at a company event in April. She was beautiful in that effortless way young women often are, with long dark hair and bright eyes and a confidence that radiated from her like heat. She'd shaken my hand firmly, smiled warmly, told me how much she'd heard about me. "Robert speaks so highly of you," she'd said, and I'd wanted to believe her. But I'd seen the way Robert looked at her when he thought no one was watching. The way his hand had lingered on the small of her back when he'd guided her through the crowd. The way he'd lit up when she'd laughed at his jokes, really laughed, not the polite chuckle I'd been offering for years. I'd gone home from that event and thrown up. Actual physical nausea at what I'd witnessed, at what I'd known, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Robert had found me in the bathroom and asked if I was feeling all right. I'd blamed it on the shrimp appetizers, said I must have eaten something bad. He'd accepted that explanation without question, maybe even with relief. Then he'd gone to sleep in the guest room, claiming he didn't want to disturb me if I was sick. At first, I'd been relieved. Robert had been complaining for months about how overworked he was, how he needed someone who could really keep up with him. Madison seemed like the perfect solution. She reorganized his calendar, streamlined his projects, even convinced him to finally upgrade to a new phone system. I was grateful, actually. Grateful that someone was taking care of him since I apparently couldn't anymore. But then the mentions became more frequent. Madison suggested this restaurant. Madison thinks we should pivot our strategy. Madison understands the pressure I'm under. Each comment felt like a tiny paper cut, so small I could pretend it didn't hurt. But paper cuts add up, don't they? Eventually, you're bleeding and you can't quite figure out when it started. Madison this, Madison that. Madison had convinced him to join a new gym. Madison thought he should update his wardrobe. Madison had recommended a podcast about leadership that was really transformative. I'd started keeping a mental tally of how many times her name came up in our conversations, and by June I'd stopped counting. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend I wasn't being replaced in real time. There was one night in particular that stood out. Early July, I think. Robert had come home around 10, later than usual but not uncommon. He'd been in a good mood, almost giddy, and I'd been so starved for his attention that I'd seized on it. I'd suggested we have a nightcap together, maybe sit on the balcony and enjoy the summer evening. He'd agreed, and for 20 beautiful minutes, it had felt like old times. Then his phone had rung. Madison's name on the screen. He'd answered immediately, walked away from me mid-sentence, spent the next 40 minutes on the call while I'd sat alone on the balcony, watching the city lights blur through tears I refused to acknowledge. When he'd finally finished, he'd gone straight to the guest room without a word. I'd slept alone in our king-sized bed, taking up all the space I wanted, pretending it was a choice rather than an abandonment. I thought about our anniversary dinner 3 months ago. Robert had been on his phone the entire time, responding to what he called urgent work matters. When I'd asked him to put it away, just for an hour, he'd looked at me like I was being unreasonable. Madison's handling a crisis with the Henderson account, he'd explained, as if that justified his complete absence from our celebration. She needs my input. I'd sat across from him at that expensive restaurant, watching him type away, and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The waiter had brought our entrees and Robert hadn't even noticed. I'd eaten my Chilean sea bass in silence, tasting nothing, feeling nothing, except a growing hollowness in my chest. The worst part was that I'd still picked up the check when it came. Still thanked him for taking me out. Still kissed him goodnight, even though it felt like pressing my lips against marble. Still pretended that everything was fine because admitting otherwise would mean confronting a reality I wasn't ready to face. The thing about being married for 37 years is that you learn each other's patterns. You know when something is off, even when you don't want to admit it. Robert had started going to the gym more, bought new clothes, switched to a different cologne. He was getting his hair cut more frequently, whitening his teeth, paying attention to details he'd neglected for years. I'd tried to convince myself it was a midlife thing, a harmless attempt to hold on to youth. Men do that, don't they? But there were other signs. Signs I'd cataloged in the dark corners of my mind. The way he'd started doing his own laundry, as if he didn't want me seeing his clothes, noticing stains or scents that didn't belong. The way he'd changed his phone password, something we'd always shared before. The way he'd started taking calls in his car, in the hallway, anywhere but near me. I'd found a receipt once, tucked in his jacket pocket when I'd been taking it to the dry cleaner. Dinner for 2 at an intimate French restaurant in the West Loop, a place he'd never taken me. The date was a Thursday in June, a night he'd claimed to be working late on a presentation. The bill had been over $300, 2 bottles of expensive wine, appetizers to share, 2 desserts. People don't order 2 desserts at a business dinner. I'd held that receipt in my shaking hands for 20 minutes, standing in our walk-in closet, surrounded by his expensive suits and my carefully organized shoes. I could have confronted him, could have demanded the truth right then. Instead, I'd put the receipt back exactly where I'd found it, sent the jacket to the cleaner, and never mentioned it. Cowardice, probably. or self-preservation. Some days I still can't tell the difference. That night, I'd lain awake in our bed, listening to the sounds of the city below, replaying every interaction from the past months. How many times had I made excuses for him? How many red flags had I deliberately ignored? I'd gotten up at 3 a.m, walked to the kitchen in the dark, and poured myself a glass of water with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I'd stood at the window, looking out at the sleeping city, and asked myself the question I'd been avoiding for months. If I confronted him and he admitted the affair, what would I do? Would I leave? Where would I go? Who would I be without this life, without this identity I'd built over 37 years? The honest answer terrified me. I didn't know. I'd become so enmeshed in being Robert's wife, in maintaining this facade of the perfect marriage, that I couldn't imagine an alternative. So I'd climbed back into bed, pulled the covers up to my chin, and chosen denial. Chosen to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen, didn't know what I knew. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the moment I truly lost myself. Not gradually over years, but in that single choice to prioritize comfort over truth, security over dignity. I'd sold my self-respect for the illusion of stability, and the price had been higher than I'd ever imagined. The weeks after finding that receipt had been strange. I'd found myself watching Robert obsessively, looking for more evidence, more proof. I'd check his phone when he was in the shower, though the password change meant I couldn't get in. I'd smell his clothes when I did laundry, looking for unfamiliar perfume. I'd analyze every word he said, every expression on his face, trying to catch him in a lie. It was exhausting, living like a detective in my own marriage. The paranoia ate at me, made me irritable and anxious. I'd snap at him over small things, then immediately apologize, afraid of pushing him further away. I was caught in a terrible cycle, suspicious and hurt, but too afraid to confront the source of my pain. Robert had noticed my behavior, of course. "You've been tense lately," he'd said one evening in August. We were getting ready for bed, moving around each other in the practiced choreography of a long marriage. "Is everything okay?" I'd wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Was everything okay? My husband was having an affair and asking me if I was okay, as if my tension existed in a vacuum, unrelated to his actions, but instead I'd said, "Just tired, haven't been sleeping well." "Maybe you should see a doctor," he'd suggested, already turning away, dismissing my concerns as he dismissed everything about me. "Get something to help you sleep." So I had. I'd gone to my doctor, lied about generalized anxiety, and gotten a prescription for pills I didn't want to take. Another layer of pretense, another way of treating symptoms while ignoring the disease. There had been other discoveries too. Small things that added up to an undeniable pattern. A charge on our credit card statement for flowers I'd never received. Hotel points accumulated in his rewards account that didn't correspond to his business trips. A new tendency to take showers as soon as he got home, even when he'd supposedly been at the office all day. Each discovery was a small death, a tiny mourning for what I'd thought my marriage was. I'd created a mental file of evidence, adding to it with each new finding, but never acting on it. The file grew heavier with each passing week, a burden I carried alone because I couldn't bring myself to share it with anyone. I'd tried to talk to Robert once, in a roundabout way. It was early September, one of those rare evenings when we were both home and awake at the same time. He was working on his laptop at the dining room table, and I'd brought him tea, a peace offering for a war he didn't even know we were fighting. "Robert," I'd started, my heart pounding. "Do you ever think about us? About our marriage?" He'd looked up from his screen, annoyed at the interruption. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you happy? Are we happy?" "Eleanor, I'm in the middle of something important. Can we talk about this later?" Later never came. It never does when someone doesn't want to have a conversation. I'd retreated, carrying my untouched tea back to the kitchen, and hated myself for my cowardice. Why couldn't I just ask the direct question? Why couldn't I demand the truth? But I knew why. Because once the truth was spoken, I'd have to deal with it. And I wasn't ready. Maybe I'd never be ready. The thing about living with a lie is that you start to believe it yourself. I'd gotten so good at pretending everything was fine that sometimes I almost convinced myself. I'd go days without thinking about the affair, distracted by mundane tasks and daily routines. Then something would remind me, a text message, a late night at the office, the smell of that new cologne, and the whole fragile construct would come crashing down again. I'd started having panic attacks in the shower, the only place where Robert couldn't hear me. I'd turn the water on hot and let it beat down on my back while I hyperventilated, trying to breathe through the suffocating knowledge of my situation. Then I'd compose myself, dry off, and walk out into the apartment with a smile on my face, ready to play my role for another day. But deep down, I knew. The way he'd become irritable when I asked about his day. The way he'd started sleeping in the guest room, claiming his insomnia was too disruptive. The way he looked through me instead of at me, as if I were a piece of furniture he'd grown tired of but couldn't quite bring himself to replace. Or maybe he could. Maybe that was exactly what he was doing, piece by piece, day by day. Replacing me with someone shinier, newer, more exciting. Someone who didn't carry the weight of 37 years, who didn't remind him of promises he no longer wanted to keep. My teacup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. My hands were shaking worse now. I stood up and walked to our bedroom, to the closet that held 37 years of accumulated life. I pulled out a box from the top shelf, old photo albums I hadn't looked at in years. Robert had suggested we digitize everything, throw out the physical copies. We need to declutter, he'd said. But I'd kept them, hidden away where he wouldn't see them and suggest they needed organizing. I sat on our bed and opened the first album. Our wedding day, outside a small church on the south side. I was wearing my mother's dress, altered to fit me, holding a bouquet of white roses. Robert looked so young, so earnest in his rented tuxedo. We were both grinning like fools, so certain we'd found forever. I traced my finger over the photograph, remembering that day with painful clarity. It had rained in the morning, and I'd been convinced it was a bad omen. But by the time we'd taken our vows, the sun had broken through the clouds, and Robert had whispered that it was a sign of good things to come. "We survived the storm," he'd said. "Everything else will be easy." How wrong we'd been. Or maybe how wrong I'd been. Maybe for Robert, everything had been easy. Maybe I'd made it too easy, smoothing over every conflict, swallowing every complaint, reshaping myself to fit whatever he needed until there was nothing left of the original me. There were pictures from our honeymoon in New York, from the birth of our daughter Sarah, from her first birthday party in our tiny apartment before Robert's career took off. Pictures of holidays, of family dinners, of ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because we were building something together. I paused on a photo from Sarah's 5th birthday. We'd had a party in the park, just a few friends and their kids, cake from the grocery store that I'd decorated myself. Sarah was covered in chocolate frosting, laughing, and Robert and I were on either side of her, our arms around each other, looking at our daughter with such pure joy. We'd been happy then, genuinely, uncomplicated happy. When had it gotten complicated? Was it when Robert's career took off and suddenly we were attending events where I felt out of place? Was it when we moved to this apartment and I lost my neighborhood, my connections, my sense of community? Was it when Sarah went to college and we no longer had a buffer, someone to focus on besides each other? Or was it earlier, more gradual, a slow erosion I'd been too close to see? Like water wearing away stone, so gentle you don't notice until there's a canyon where solid ground used to be. Sarah. I needed to call Sarah. But what would I say? Your father is about to tell me something terrible, and I already know what it is? Our daughter lived in Los Angeles now, pursuing her film career, calling once a week out of obligation more than desire. She'd grown distant over the years, especially after she went to college. Robert had been furious when she chose art school over business school, when she moved across the country instead of staying close to home. I'd tried to be the mediator, tried to keep peace between them, but I'd only succeeded in alienating both of them. Sarah had accused me once, during a particularly heated argument about her career choices, of never taking her side. "You always defend him," she'd said, her voice sharp with hurt. "Even when he's wrong, even when he's being cruel, you just sit there and make excuses for him. When did you stop having a backbone, Mom?" I'd been wounded by that, had tried to explain that marriage was about unity, about presenting a united front. But Sarah had shaken her head sadly. "There's a difference between unity and cowardice," she'd said, and I'd heard Margaret's words echoing through my daughter's mouth. The women in my life had been trying to tell me something for years, and I'd been too stubborn, too scared, too invested in the fantasy to listen. The last time Sarah visited was Christmas, and it had been tense. She'd made comments about how unhappy I looked, how I'd let myself fade into the background. "Mom, when did you stop having opinions?" she'd asked one night when Robert was asleep. I'd laughed it off, told her I was fine, everything was fine. But she'd looked at me with such pity that I'd had to leave the room. I'd found her crying in the guest room later that night. When I'd asked what was wrong, she'd pulled me into a hug and held me so tight I could barely breathe. "I miss you, Mom," she'd whispered. "I miss the woman you used to be." I hadn't known what to say to that, hadn't wanted to admit that I missed her too. That woman. The one I'd buried so deep I wasn't sure I could find her anymore. I closed the albums and returned them to the closet. The clock read 4:30, an hour and a half until Robert came home. An hour and a half until my life changed in whatever way it was going to change. I walked through the apartment, room by room, as if seeing it for the first time. Or maybe the last time. The living room with its uncomfortable designer furniture that no one ever sat on. The dining room where we used to host dinner parties, back when Robert still wanted to show me off to his colleagues. The kitchen with its professional-grade appliances that I barely knew how to use because we ate out so often. I paused in the hallway, looking at the gallery wall of photographs. All professional shots, taken by the photographer Robert had hired. Perfectly lit, perfectly composed, perfectly fake. We looked happy in these pictures, but I could see the truth now. The way my smile didn't reach my eyes, the way Robert's hand rested on my shoulder without really touching me. The way we stood together but apart, like actors playing roles rather than spouses living a life. There was one photograph that stood out. It had been taken at a charity gala 5 years ago, one of those black tie events that Robert loved and I endured. I was wearing a designer gown that Robert had picked out, sapphire blue because he said it matched my eyes. But I looked uncomfortable, restricted, like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Robert stood beside me, looking proud and powerful, the successful executive with the elegant wife. We looked like we belonged in a magazine spread. We looked nothing like ourselves. I remembered that night vividly. Robert had been honored for some business achievement, and I'd been expected to stand beside him, smile, and play the supportive spouse. During his acceptance speech, he'd thanked his team, his mentors, his colleagues. Me, he'd mentioned in passing, and of course, my wife Eleanor, who keeps the home fires burning. That's what I'd been reduced to. Not a partner. Not an equal, but someone who managed domestic details while he conquered the business world. I'd clapped along with everyone else, my hands coming together mechanically while something inside me withered. One of the other wives had leaned over and whispered, "You must be so proud." And I'd nodded, because what else could I do? Admit that I felt invisible, insignificant, utterly erased by the man who was supposed to love me? After the gala in the car ride home, I'd tried to talk to Robert about it. You didn't really mention me in your speech, I'd said quietly, trying to keep my voice neutral. What are you talking about? I thanked you. You said I keep the home fires burning. That's it. After 32 years of marriage, that's all I am to you. Someone who manages the household? He'd sighed, that particular sigh he reserved for when I was being difficult. Eleanor, it was a business event. What did you want me to do? Recite poetry about you? You're being oversensitive. Oversensitive. That was his favorite dismissal. Anytime I expressed hurt or frustration, I was being oversensitive. My feelings were excessive, unreasonable, somehow my fault, rather than a valid response to his behavior. I'd stopped talking after that, stared out the window at the passing city, and felt the distance between us grow even wider. He'd spent the rest of the ride checking his phone, probably already forgotten our conversation. But I'd carried that moment with me, added it to the accumulating weight of all the other times I'd been diminished, dismissed, made to feel like I was asking for too much by simply wanting to be seen. The study held more memories, though I rarely went in there anymore. It had become Robert's domain, filled with his books, his awards, his carefully curated image of success. There was a photograph on his desk of the three of us from 10 years ago, Sarah's college graduation. We looked like a family in that picture, united in celebration of our daughter's achievement. I walked in now, my feet silent on the thick carpet. Everything was precisely organized, sterile and impersonal, except for that one family photo. I picked it up, studying Sarah's face. She'd been so happy that day, so full of hope for the future. Robert had already been disappointed in her choice of major, but he'd hidden it well for the cameras. The fight had come later, at dinner. Sarah had announced her plans to move to Los Angeles, to pursue filmmaking seriously. Robert had put down his fork with a sharp clink against the plate. That's not a career, Sarah. That's a hobby. It's what I love, Dad. Love doesn't pay the bills. You need to think practically. Come work at my firm, learn the business. There's still time to get an MBA. I don't want to work at your firm. I don't want an MBA. I want to make films. The argument had escalated from there, voices rising, old resentments surfacing. And I'd sat there, trapped in the middle, trying to mediate, trying to keep peace. In the end, I'd sided with Robert, gently suggesting that Sarah keep her options open, maybe work at the firm for a year or two before making such a big decision. Sarah had looked at me with such betrayal in her eyes. I thought you of all people would understand, she'd said quietly. You gave up teaching. Didn't you ever regret it? I had, of course. I'd loved teaching, loved working with children, loved having purpose and identity beyond being Robert's wife. But I'd quit when Sarah was born, and Robert's career had been demanding, and somehow I'd never gone back. The years had slipped by, and returning to teaching had seemed increasingly impossible. I'd convinced myself I was happy being a full-time mother, then later, when Sarah was grown, simply being a wife. But I hadn't told Sarah any of that. Instead, I'd said, I made my choices, you'll make yours. She'd left the next day, barely saying goodbye. Our relationship had been strained ever since, and I knew it was my fault. I'd chosen Robert's approval over my daughter's dreams, and she'd never quite forgiven me. How could she, when I couldn't forgive myself? I set the photograph back down on Robert's desk, my hands trembling. So many choices, so many moments where I'd chosen wrong, prioritized the wrong things, betrayed the wrong people. Most of all, I'd betrayed myself. The desk drawers were slightly open, and I knew I shouldn't look, knew that whatever I found would only hurt more. But my hand moved anyway, pulling open the top drawer. Inside were the usual items, pens, business cards, a leather notebook. I opened the notebook, saw Robert's handwriting, notes from meetings and appointments. Then, on one page, something different. Not business notes, but what looked like a draft of a letter. It began, and I knew immediately who M was. I can't stop thinking about last night, the way you looked at me, the way you... I slammed the notebook shut, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't need to read more. Didn't want to know the details of their intimacy, the private moments they shared. I shoved the drawer closed and backed away from the desk as if it had burned me. My heart was racing, my vision blurring with tears. This was real. This was happening. And in a few hours, Robert was going to come home and make it official, end our marriage, replace me completely. Part of me wanted to take that notebook, confront him with it, throw his own words back in his face. But what would be the point? He was already planning to leave. Evidence of his affair wasn't going to change anything except make the confrontation more painful. I left the study, closing the door behind me, and leaned against the hallway wall. The apartment suddenly felt enormous and suffocating at the same time, full of memories and empty of meaning. Everything here was tied to Robert, to a life that was about to end. Who would I be when this was over? Where would I even go? I opened the refrigerator. Half a bottle of white wine, some leftover takeout, expensive cheeses that Robert liked. No real food, no ingredients for an actual meal. When had I stopped cooking? When had we stopped sharing meals that weren't served by waiters in restaurants where you needed reservations weeks in advance? I used to love cooking. When Sarah was young, I'd make dinner every night, trying new recipes, filling our old apartment with the smells of garlic and herbs and fresh-baked bread. Robert would come home and kiss me, ask what smelled so good, tell me he'd married the best cook in Chicago. We'd sit around our small table, the three of us, and talk about our days. Really talk, sharing stories and laughter and the comfortable intimacy of a family. This kitchen, beautiful and modern and expensive, had never smelled like anything except the faint chemical scent of cleaning products. The stove was practically pristine, barely used. The refrigerator was a museum of takeout containers and expensive ingredients that would probably go bad before anyone thought to cook them. This wasn't a home. It was a showcase, a display, a carefully curated image of success that had nothing to do with actual life. I poured myself a glass of wine, even though it was barely 5 o'clock. My hands were steadier now. The numbness was setting in, that protective coating that develops when you know pain is coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. I thought about taking a pill, something to dull the edges of what was coming. I had a prescription for anxiety medication that my doctor had given me last year when I'd finally admitted I wasn't sleeping well. I'd taken them irregularly, afraid of becoming dependent, afraid of admitting how bad things had gotten. But now I wondered why I'd bothered with that restraint. What was I saving myself for? What was I protecting? But no, I wanted to be fully present for this, wanted to feel every moment of it, remember every detail. If this was the end of my marriage, I owed it to myself to witness it with clear eyes. I'd spent too long in a fog, pretending and avoiding and making excuses. Not anymore. The sun was starting to set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I stood at the window and watched the colors shift and change, thinking about all the sunsets I'd watched alone while Robert worked late. All the nights I'd gone to bed in an empty apartment, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. This view had been one of the selling points of the apartment. Robert had been so excited when he'd first shown it to me, pointing out the panoramic windows, the western exposure, the way the light would fill the space during golden hour. "Think of all the sunsets we'll watch together," he'd said, and I'd fallen in love with the vision he'd painted. Our future together, growing old in this beautiful space, watching the sky change colors year after year after year. How many of those sunsets had we actually watched together? Maybe a dozen in 30 years. The rest I'd seen alone, or ignored entirely because witnessing beauty by yourself only emphasizes the loneliness. I heard it now. That familiar sound. The key in the lock, the door opening, the heavy footsteps of a man who belonged here, but hadn't really been present in months. My heart started racing despite the wine, despite the numbness. I turned from the window and waited. Robert came in looking tired, but also energized in a way I hadn't seen in years. He was wearing one of his new suits, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe. His hair was perfect, his face freshly shaved. He looked like a man who'd just come from somewhere important, somewhere that mattered. He looked like a man in love. Just not with me. He saw me standing in the living room and stopped. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, heavy with things unsaid. I could see him gathering his courage, preparing his speech. He'd probably rehearsed this, maybe with her, maybe alone in his car on the drive home. Maybe he'd practiced in the mirror, tried on different approaches, different phrasings. The businessman in him would want to get it right, deliver the message cleanly, minimize the fallout. "Eleanor," he finally said, "just my name, nothing else." "You wanted to talk," I replied, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie. These little rituals, so familiar after decades of marriage. I'd watched him perform these same actions thousands of times, but tonight every movement felt loaded with meaning. He was removing his armor, preparing for battle. Or maybe he was just uncomfortable, and I was reading too much into old habits. "Yes, we need to talk." I sat down on the couch, the uncomfortable designer couch that cost more than my first car. The leather was cold against my legs, smooth and unwelcoming. Everything in this apartment was like that. Beautiful to look at, terrible to live with. He remained standing, looking out at the view I'd been admiring moments before. "I've been thinking about this conversation for a long time," he began. "About how to say this, about whether to say it at all." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I kept my voice level, controlled. "Just say it, Robert." He turned to face me. In the fading light, I could see new lines around his eyes, gray in his temples that hadn't been there a year ago. We were both getting older, both changing, but we'd been changing apart, hadn't we? Not together the way we'd promised. He'd aged well, I thought, with a detached kind of observation. The gray at his temples made him look distinguished. The lines around his eyes gave him character. Men were allowed to age into wisdom and gravitas. Women just aged. "Madison is pregnant," he said. 3 words. That's all it took to confirm what I'd already known in my bones. 3 words to end a marriage that had lasted longer than some people's entire lives. I stood there absorbing the impact, feeling the ground shift beneath me. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I'd already done my grieving, alone in this empty apartment during all those nights he'd claimed to be working late. Still, hearing it said out loud was different than knowing it in the abstract. It made it real, concrete, undeniable. My husband had gotten another woman pregnant. The words bounced around my skull, trying to find a place to settle, a framework to fit into. But there was no framework for this. Nothing in 37 years of marriage had prepared me for this moment. "How long?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded like a stranger's, calm and curious, as if we were discussing the weather or his golf game. "Eleanor, it's not what you think." "How long, Robert?" He ran his hand through his perfect hair, mussing it slightly, a crack in the facade. "We became involved about 4 months ago, but Eleanor, you have to understand." 4 months. The words hit me like a physical blow. 4 months while I'd been lying to myself, making excuses, pretending everything was fine. 4 months while I'd been sleeping alone, eating alone, existing in this apartment like a ghost, haunting her own life. I don't have to understand anything. My voice was still calm, still controlled. Inside, though, I was coming apart. 4 months. While I'd been making excuses for his distance, for his new habits, for the way he looked through me like I wasn't even there. 4 months of lies. "I never meant for this to happen," he continued, and I could hear the rehearsed quality to his words now. This was the speech he'd prepared, the explanation he'd crafted to make himself feel better. Madison and we connected on a professional level first. She understands the pressures of my work, the demands of my position. We'd stay late working on projects and we clicked. Clicked. As if our marriage was a puzzle piece that didn't fit anymore and he'd found a better match. As if 37 years could be undone because someone understood his PowerPoint presentations. So this is my fault? The words came out sharper than I intended. Because I don't understand your work? Because I'm not ambitious enough? Because I chose to be a teacher instead of climbing some corporate ladder? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I walked to the window, putting distance between us. I needed space, needed air, needed to not be looking at his face while he dismantled our life together. You've been saying it for years, Robert, every time you dismissed my opinions. Every time you made decisions without consulting me. Every time you chose work over us. That's not fair. I've given you everything. This apartment, the lifestyle, the security. And there it was. The transactional view of marriage that he'd developed somewhere along the way. I provide money and status, therefore I'm fulfilling my obligations. Never mind the emotional abandonment, the isolation, the slow erosion of partnership and intimacy. He'd given me things, therefore he'd given me everything. Everything except yourself. I turned to face him. When did you stop seeing me, Robert? When did I become invisible to you? He had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. For a moment, I thought he might actually engage with the question, might actually be honest about the decay of our marriage. But then his face closed off, became the corporate mask he wore to board meetings and negotiations. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual. We grew apart. No, you grew away. I stayed exactly where I'd always been, waiting for you to remember I existed. The tears were coming now, hot and unwelcome. I wiped them away angrily. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Didn't want him to walk away from this conversation thinking of me as the weepy, pathetic wife he'd outgrown. I wanted him to see what he was losing, what he was throwing away. But how could I show him that when I wasn't even sure I knew anymore? What do you want from me? He asked, and there was frustration in his voice now. Impatience. He'd come here to deliver his news and move on with his life, and I was making it complicated, making it emotional, making it real. An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I fell in love with someone else. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to fix what was broken between us. I'm sorry I hurt you. The apology felt hollow, performative. Words said because they were expected, not because they were meant. But what had I expected? That he'd break down, realize his mistake, beg for my forgiveness? That ship had sailed months ago, maybe years ago. Maybe the moment he'd decided I was no longer worth fighting for. Don't, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut. Don't pretend this is about weakness or broken things. This is about choices. You chose to betray me. You chose to start a new life with someone else while still married to me. Don't dress it up as anything other than what it is. He was silent for a long moment, and I watched emotions flicker across his face. Guilt, anger, defensiveness, resignation. He'd expected this to be cleaner, I realized. Expected me to accept his explanations, understand his perspective, maybe even wish him well. He'd underestimated how much this would hurt, because he'd stopped thinking of me as fully human somewhere along the way. I'd become an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve, a complication in his neat new narrative. Then, I want a divorce. There it was, the other shoe dropping. Not just an affair, but an ending. The formal dissolution of everything we'd built, everything we'd been, everything I'd thought we were working toward. He wanted to erase me from his life completely, Make room for the new version of himself that didn't include the woman who'd stood by him for 37 years. She wants to keep the baby, he continued, and his voice had changed. There was something in it now, something I hadn't heard in years. Excitement, hope, wonder. We want to build a life together. Madison and I, we have a future. A real future. A real future. As if the 37 years we'd spent together were imaginary. As if our daughter, our home, our shared history meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. Just a practice round, a rough draft, a warm-up for the real life he was about to start with someone else. A baby, I heard myself say, and my voice sounded hollow, distant. You're going to be a father again. Yes. He actually smiled while telling me he'd impregnated another woman. It wasn't planned, but Madison and I were actually excited about it. It feels like a second chance. A second chance. The words cut deeper than anything else he'd said, because that's what I was to him now, wasn't I? A first chance that hadn't worked out. A failed attempt. Something to be left behind so he could start fresh. Do it right this time, with someone better. What about Sarah? I asked, grasping for something, anything that might make him see the enormity of what he was doing. Have you thought about how this will affect her? She's going to have a half-sibling young enough to be her own child. His expression hardened. Sarah made her choices. She barely speaks to us anyway. She barely speaks to you, I corrected, my voice sharp, because you dismissed her dreams, tried to force her into your vision of what her life should be, just like you did with me. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you asked me what I wanted, Robert? What I dreamed about? What would make me happy? When's the last time my feelings, my needs, my desires factored into any decision in this marriage? He was silent, and I could see him struggling to find an answer. The truth was, he couldn't remember. Because it had been years, maybe decades, since he'd considered me as anything more than a supporting character in his life story. You're being emotional, he finally said, and I wanted to laugh at the predictability of it. Of course I'm being emotional. You just told me you're leaving me for a woman half my age who's carrying your child. What exactly is the appropriate emotional response to that, Robert? Should I congratulate you? Wish you well? Help you pack? I thought you'd be more understanding. You've known things haven't been right between us for a long time. Knowing something is wrong and having your spouse confirm he's been cheating on you and starting a new family are two very different things. I walked toward him, needing him to see me, really see me, maybe for the last time. Did you ever love me? Really love me? Or was I always just convenient? The acceptable wife from the acceptable background who could give you the acceptable life. He looked uncomfortable, shifted his weight. Of course I loved you. I married you, didn't I? That's not an answer. Eleanor, what do you want me to say? That I loved you once? Fine, I did. But people change, feelings change. We're not the same people we were 37 years ago. No, we're not. I'm someone who tried to grow with her spouse, to adapt, to support, to be whatever you needed. And you're someone who replaced his wife the moment someone younger and shinier came along. I felt tears on my cheeks, but didn't bother wiping them away. When did you stop trying, Robert? When did you decide our marriage wasn't worth fighting for? When did you? He shot back, surprising me. You've been a ghost in this apartment for years, Eleanor. Going through the motions, barely speaking, barely there. Do you think I didn't notice? You checked out of this marriage long before I did. His words hit me like a slap. I checked out? You haven't touched me in over a year. You sleep in another room. You work late every night. You talk to your assistant more than you talk to your wife. And somehow this is my fault? You never complained, he said, and there was something almost defensive in his tone now. You never said you were unhappy. You just accepted everything. How was I supposed to know what you wanted when you never told me? I shouldn't have had to tell you that I wanted my husband to act like he was married to me. That's basic, Robert. That's the absolute minimum of what a marriage should be. Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe we had different expectations of what marriage should be. Apparently, I expected fidelity for one thing. He had the grace to look ashamed, at least. I never meant to hurt you. Then what did you think would happen? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Or did you just not care enough to consider how I'd feel? It's complicated. It's really not. You made a choice, multiple choices, to pursue her, to sleep with her, to get her pregnant, to ask me for a divorce. Those are all choices, Robert. Own them. I'll be fair about the settlement, he added, his voice taking on that business-like tone he used in negotiations. And that's what this was to him now, I realized. A business transaction, a deal to be structured, terms to be negotiated. You'll be taken care of financially. The apartment is worth millions now. We can split it, or you can keep it if you prefer. There's the investment portfolio, the retirement accounts. We'll divide everything equitably. Money. He was talking about money as if that could somehow compensate for what he was taking from me. As if dollars and assets could fill the void where my marriage used to be. As if I could buy a replacement life at market value, invest in a new future, dividends paid quarterly on the smoking ruins of everything I'd believed in. Get out, I said quietly. Eleanor, get out. I can't look at you right now. I can't breathe with you in this room. Just go. He grabbed his briefcase, and I saw something like relief flash across his face. He'd delivered his message. Done his duty. Now he could leave, go back to her, start building that real future he'd mentioned. Maybe she was waiting for him right now, in a hotel room or her apartment, ready to comfort him after the difficult conversation with his soon-to-be ex-wife. Maybe they'd celebrate, open champagne, toast to their future together. The thought made me nauseous. I'll stay at a hotel tonight, he said, already halfway to the door. We can discuss the logistics tomorrow when you've had time to process. Process. As if this were data to be analyzed, information to be filed away, a problem with a clear solution. As if I could sleep on it and wake up ready to negotiate the dismantling of my entire life. After he left, I stood in the middle of our expensive, empty apartment and finally let myself fall apart. I slid down to the floor, my back against the designer couch, and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place I'd been trying to ignore for months. Every tear felt like it was made of years. Years of being ignored, dismissed, taken for granted. Years of making myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating. Years of watching him pull away and telling myself it was normal, it was fine, all marriages went through rough patches. Years of lying to myself about the state of my life because the truth was too terrible to face. The sky outside had gone dark. The city lights twinkled like stars that had fallen to earth. I stayed on the floor until my body had no more tears to give, until the crying turned to hiccups and then to an eerie silence. I could see my reflection in the darkened windows, distorted and ghost-like. Is this what I'd become? A woman crying on the floor of an apartment she'd never really liked, mourning a marriage that had died years ago but nobody had bothered to pronounce dead? This was my life now. 62 years old, alone, replaced by a woman young enough to be my daughter. This was the reality I had to face. But even as I sat there in the dark, something else was stirring inside me. Something that felt almost like anger, almost like determination. I'd spent so long making myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I'd sacrificed my own needs, my own voice, to keep peace in a marriage that was already dead. Not anymore. The thought was small at first, just a flicker in the darkness. But it grew, fed by anger and hurt and something that might have been self-respect trying to claw its way back to the surface. I'd let Robert define me for so long. Let him shape my life, make my decisions, tell me who to be and how to be it. I'd erased myself so gradually I hadn't even noticed until there was almost nothing left. But almost wasn't the same as completely. There was still something there, buried deep, but not dead. The woman I used to be, the woman Sarah missed, the woman I missed. Maybe she was still recoverable. Maybe it wasn't too late. I pulled myself up from the floor, my body aching from sitting on the hard marble. I walked to my purse and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking but steady enough. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. My college roommate Jennifer, who I'd lost touch with years ago because Robert found her too opinionated, and I'd been too weak to fight him on it. Jennifer had called me regularly for the first few years after my wedding, trying to stay close, trying to maintain our friendship. But Robert had always made comments when she'd call. "Your friend talks too much. Does she always have to be so loud? I don't understand what you have in common with her anymore." Little comments, small criticisms, but they'd added up. Eventually, I'd started screening her calls, returning them less frequently, making excuses about being busy. Eventually, she'd stopped calling. I'd told myself it was natural that people drifted apart, but the truth was I'd let her go because it was easier than fighting Robert about it. My finger hovered over her name. It was late, but Jennifer had always been a night owl, and it had been. What? 8 years since we'd last spoken? Maybe more. What if she didn't want to hear from me? What if she was angry, resentful, done with a friend who'd chosen her husband over everyone else in her life? But I needed to try, needed to reach out to someone who'd known me before Robert, who remembered the Eleanor I used to be. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed call. She answered on the third ring. "Eleanor, is that really you?" Hearing her voice, warm and familiar despite the years, nearly broke me all over again. There was no anger in it, no resentment, just surprise and something that sounded like genuine happiness. "Hi, Jen. I know it's been a long time, but I need a friend." There was a pause and I braced myself for the rejection I probably deserved. But then, "I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm here." And just like that, with those simple words, I took my first step toward finding myself again, toward becoming someone other than Robert's invisible wife, toward a future I couldn't yet imagine but was determined to claim. "He's leaving me," I said, and the words came tumbling out. "Robert. He's having an affair with his assistant, and she's pregnant, and he wants a divorce, and I don't know what to do. I don't know who I am without him, Jen. I've spent so long being his wife that I forgot how to be anything else." "Oh, sweetie." Jennifer's voice was soft, sympathetic, but there was steel underneath. The same steel that had intimidated Robert, that had made him uncomfortable. "First of all, you're going to be okay. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but you will. And second, I'm coming to Chicago." "What? No, you don't have to." "I'm coming. Tomorrow. I'll get the first flight out. You shouldn't be alone right now." Tears were streaming down my face again, but they felt different this time. Not hopeless, but cleansing. Like they were washing away years of accumulated hurt and making room for something new. "Thank you," I whispered. That's what friends are for. The real kind. The ones who show up when everything falls apart. I should have shown up years ago. Should have fought harder to stay in your life. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. We talked for over an hour. I told her everything. The whole sorry story of my marriage's slow death. The isolation, the dismissal, the gradual erasure of everything I'd been. And she listened, really listened, in a way no one had listened to me in years. "You know what I remember about you in college?" Jennifer said at one point. "You were fierce. You had opinions about everything, and you weren't afraid to share them. You organized that protest against the administration when they tried to cut funding for the arts. You tutored kids in the community for free every weekend. You had fire in you, Ellie. Real, genuine fire." "That woman is gone," I said. "No, she's not. She's just been buried, under years of being told she wasn't enough, wasn't right, wasn't what someone else needed her to be. But buried isn't the same as dead. We're going to dig her up together." I wanted to believe her, but the doubt was overwhelming. Jen, I'm 62 years old. I haven't worked in over 3 decades. I don't have skills. I don't have a career. I don't even have friends anymore because I let them all go to keep Robert happy. What kind of life can I possibly build at this age? A real one, she said firmly. One that's yours. Listen, Ellie, I'm not going to lie and say this will be easy. It won't be. Divorce at any age is hard, and starting over at 62 comes with challenges. But you know what's harder? Spending the next 20 or 30 years in the half-life you've been living. Invisible, dismissed, erased. You're not dead yet, and you deserve more than being treated like you are. Her words settled into me, finding a place in the hollow where my self-worth used to live. I'm scared, I admitted. Of course you are. Fear is appropriate. But let me ask you something. What's the worst that can happen? I thought about it. I end up alone, poor, maybe, living in some tiny apartment, working a minimum wage job because that's all I can get. No one to care if I live or die. Okay. And is that really worse than what you have now? You're already alone, Ellie. You've been alone for years, just with expensive furniture around you. At least if you leave, you have a chance to find something real. People who actually see you, care about you, value you. She was right, and I knew it. The fear of the unknown had kept me trapped in a known misery, but the unknown at least held possibility. This life, the one I was living now, held nothing but more of the same slow erasure. What do I do? I asked. Practically, I mean. Where do I even start? First, you get a good lawyer. Not just any lawyer, the best divorce attorney in Chicago. Someone who will fight for you. Make sure Robert doesn't screw you over in the settlement. You've been married for 37 years. You gave up your career for him. You deserve a significant portion of everything he has. The thought of fighting Robert for money felt mercenary, uncomfortable. But Jennifer was quick to correct that thinking. Don't you dare feel guilty about taking what's yours, she said, reading my hesitation. You earned it, Ellie. Every penny of his success is built on the foundation you provided. Who kept his home? Who raised his daughter? Who played the perfect wife at every corporate function, charmed his colleagues, made him look good? You did. That has value, and you deserve to be compensated for it. I don't even know any lawyers. I do. I'll send you names tomorrow, people I trust. In the meantime, I want you to do something for me. What? Start documenting everything. Every financial account you know about, every asset, every property. Take pictures of anything valuable in the apartment. If he has any emails or documents that prove the affair, save copies. I know it feels sneaky, but trust me. You need to protect yourself. Robert's already shown you who he is. Believe him. I thought about the notebook in his desk, the love letter to Madison. Should I photograph it? The thought made me feel sick, but Jennifer was right. I needed to be practical, strategic. Emotion had guided me for too long, and look where it had gotten me. There's a notebook in his desk, I said quietly, with things written to her. I could photograph it. Do it. Tonight, before he comes back. Document everything you can. We talked more about practical matters. Jennifer explained how divorce worked in Illinois, what I could expect in terms of timeline and process. She talked about therapy, about finding support groups for women going through similar situations. She even mentioned a book club she was part of, extending an invitation before I'd even asked. By the time we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Small, fragile, tentative, but real. Maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe the woman I used to be wasn't completely gone. Maybe she could be excavated from beneath the rubble of this failed marriage. I walked back to Robert's study, phone in hand. The notebook was where I'd left it. And I photographed every page of that letter, hands shaking, but determined. Then I went through the apartment systematically, photographing everything. The art on the walls, the jewelry in my drawer, the expensive electronics, the designer furniture. Creating a record of the life we'd built, the assets we'd accumulated. It took me 2 hours, but when I was done, I had hundreds of photographs. Proof of what existed, what had value, what I'd be fighting for. I uploaded them all to a cloud account Robert didn't know about, making sure they were safe, accessible. Then I started going through drawers, looking for financial documents. I found bank statements showing accounts I didn't know we had, investment portfolios worth far more than I'd realized. Robert had always handled the finances, said I shouldn't worry about such things. Another way he'd kept me dependent, kept me in the dark about our true financial situation. I photographed it all, every statement, every account number, every piece of paper that might be relevant. My phone storage was nearly full by the time I finished, but I felt powerful in a way I hadn't in years. I was taking action, protecting myself, preparing for the battle ahead. It was past midnight when I finally stopped, exhausted but wired with adrenaline. I sat on the couch with a glass of wine and looked out at the city, thinking about everything that would change in the coming weeks and months. Robert would be shocked when he saw how prepared I was. He probably expected me to roll over, accept whatever he offered, grateful for his generosity. After all, that's what I'd always done before. But not this time. This time, I was going to fight. When we finally hung up, it was nearly midnight. I felt exhausted, but also strangely energized. The storm was coming, I could feel it. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was ready to weather it. On my own terms this time. Not his, mine. I walked through the apartment one more time, looking at it with new eyes. This place had never been my home, not really. It had been Robert's vision, Robert's achievement, Robert's trophy. Just like I'd been, I suppose. Something to display, to show off his success. Look what I've built. Look what I can afford. Look at the elegant wife who fits the image. But I was done being a display piece. Done fitting images. Done making myself small to fit into someone else's vision of what my life should be. I went to the bedroom and opened the closet. Reached up to the top shelf and pulled down those boxes from the basement. The ones with my personal touches, my grandmother's books, the children's artwork, the colorful pillows. Tomorrow, I'd put them out. Fill this sterile space with things that actually meant something to me. But tonight, right now, I needed to do something symbolic. Something that marked this as a turning point. A line in the sand between who I'd been and who I was becoming. I pulled out my grandmother's bookshelf, the one the designer had dismissed as visual clutter. It was oak, hand-carved, nothing fancy, but beautiful in its simplicity. My grandmother had kept her most precious books on it, and I'd inherited it after she died. It had sat in that basement storage unit for 5 years, gathering dust while I filled my apartment with furniture that looked good but meant nothing. I dragged it into the living room, positioning it against the wall where an expensive abstract painting currently hung. The painting was worth thousands, supposedly, chosen by the designer to complement the color scheme. I took it down without ceremony, leaned it against the wall facing backward. Then I started filling the bookshelf with my grandmother's books, running my fingers over the worn spines, remembering afternoons spent reading in her small apartment. She would have hated this place, I realized. Would have called it cold and pretentious. Would have asked me why I'd let someone else choose how to decorate my own home. She'd been a formidable woman, my grandmother. Widowed young, she'd raised 3 children alone, worked as a seamstress, never took anything from anyone. She would have been ashamed of what I'd become. Or rather, what I'd allowed myself to become. "I'm sorry, Grandma," I whispered to the empty room. "I lost my way, but I'm finding it again." I pulled out more items from the boxes. a colorful quilt my mother had made, which I threw over the back of the uncomfortable designer couch. Framed drawings from my former students, which I hung in the hallway, replacing the sterile professional photographs. A ceramic vase I'd made in a pottery class years ago, lopsided and imperfect, but mine. With each item I placed, I felt a little more solid, a little more real. This apartment had been a museum to Robert's success, a carefully curated display of wealth and taste. But it had never been a home. Maybe now it could start to be one, at least for however long I stayed here. I called Sarah. It was late, nearly 1 in the morning Chicago time, but only 11 in Los Angeles. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding surprised. "Mom, is everything okay?" "No," I said, and hearing myself say it out loud to my daughter released something in me. "Everything is not okay. Your father is leaving me for his assistant. She's pregnant. He wants a divorce." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Are you serious?" "Completely." "That bastard." Sarah's voice was sharp with anger. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know he's my father. But what an absolute bastard. Are you okay?" "That's a stupid question. Of course you're not okay. Where are you? Are you alone?" "I'm at the apartment, and yes, I'm alone. But Jennifer is coming tomorrow." "You remember Jennifer from college?" "Vaguely. The loud one with the opinions?" I laughed, despite everything. "That's her. We reconnected tonight. She's helping me figure out what to do." "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked, and I could hear her moving around, probably getting comfortable for a long conversation. "I want to divorce him, take him for everything I can get, and then I want to figure out who I am when I'm not his wife." "Good." Sarah's voice was fierce. "That's so good, Mom. I've been waiting years for you to stand up to him." "I know. You and Margaret both tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. I'm sorry, Sarah, for so many things. For not supporting you when you wanted to pursue film. For always taking his side. For showing you what a marriage looks like when one person erases themselves for the other." "Mom," Sarah's voice cracked. "You don't have to apologize." "I do, though. I failed you. I failed myself. I became everything I never wanted to be, and I let it happen so gradually I didn't even notice until it was too late." "It's not too late," Sarah said. "You're 62, not dead. You have years ahead of you, Mom. Decades, hopefully. You could do anything. Be anyone." "Like what? I haven't worked in over 30 years. I don't have a career, Sarah. I don't even know what I'm good at anymore beyond arranging flowers and making small talk at corporate functions." "You're good at so many things. You were an incredible teacher. Your students loved you. You're smart, compassionate, organized. You can do anything you set your mind to." "I'm scared," I admitted. "I know. But you're also brave. Braver than you think. Calling me right now, telling me the truth instead of pretending everything is fine? That takes courage, Mom. You've been protecting Dad's image for so long, protecting his feelings, making excuses for him. The fact that you're done doing that, that's huge." We talked for another hour. Sarah told me about her life in Los Angeles, her work on independent films, her girlfriend that she'd been afraid to tell me about because she thought I'd judge her or tell Robert. Hearing that she'd been hiding part of herself from me because she didn't trust me to accept her broke my heart. "I want you to know," I said, "that I love you exactly as you are. And I'm sorry I made you feel like you couldn't be yourself around me. That changes now. Everything changes now. I love you too, Mom. And I'm proud of you. For what you're about to do. For standing up for yourself. Finally." After we hung up, I felt lighter somehow. Unburdened. I'd been carrying so much shame, so much guilt about the kind of mother I'd been, the kind of wife I'd been, the kind of woman I'd become. But Sarah didn't hate me. She wanted me to succeed, to find myself, to build a better life. I walked through the apartment one more time, looking at the changes I'd already made. The bookshelf, the quilt, the children's drawings, small rebellions against the sterile perfection Robert had imposed. Tomorrow I'd make more changes. I'd call lawyers, start the divorce process, begin dismantling the life we'd built together. But I'd also start building something new, something mine, something real. Tomorrow, Jennifer would arrive. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out who Eleanor Chen was, separate from Eleanor Chen Whitmore, Robert's wife. Tomorrow, I'd take the first real steps toward reclaiming my life. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve. Not just for the marriage I'd lost, but for all the years I'd spent losing myself, for the woman I'd been who'd gradually faded away, for the life I'd thought I was building that had turned out to be built on sand. Yet there was something else too, mixed in with the grief. Something that felt like anger, like determination, like the first stirrings of self-respect. I'd been dormant for so long, playing dead to keep peace. But I wasn't dead. I was very much alive, and I was done apologizing for taking up space in my own life. I lay in the